seeking to number them, for they are more than all the grains of sand. When I awake, I'm still within your hand. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb, and I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made in my mother's womb. In my mother's womb.
Now, at the end of this valley was another, called the Valley of the Shadow of Death, and Christian must needs go through it, because the way to the celestial city lay through the midst of it. Now the valley is a very solitary place.
It's a very cold day outside today, but it's getting a little warmer in here, and John and I will be comfortable before the shooting's over, I'm sure. I wanted to start off by, before we get to the Valley of the Shadow of Death, I wanted to say thank you to Patty Scaife, who this past week was at church and had the good sense to help my mother, Norma, when she was in trouble in church and call, and we got her to the hospital, and things are looking up, and Norma's now in physical therapy. So Norma, when you're watching, I love you, girl. And Patty, I thank you very much for not only watching, as you say you do, but for being wise in the handling of my mother. I appreciate that very much. As you know, Bunyan's having this dream about his character Christian, which is really almost a reflection of Bunyan's life. And for those of you who don't watch every week, I need to remind you that Bunyan is spending 12 years in prison for preaching really as a nonconformist in England in the 1600s. And he's suffering personally. It's not the type of prison that is a morbid kind of a place, but it's prison. He's away from his 4 children and his new wife, his first wife having died some 4 or 5 years before this. It's a sacrifice he's making for the truth's sake, and a sacrifice he's making for his conscience sake. And as he tells this allegory, he comes to this part that was on the screen. Now, at the end of this valley, well, the valley that we were at the end of, you might remember from the last time, was the Valley of Humiliation. It was he's been fighting with Apollyon. He has this big spiritual battle, and with the creature that has wings like a dragon, a face like a lion. It belches smoke and fire. It has scales covering it like a fish, and it has bear's feet. And if you remember, he looks like he's going to die in this battle after a protracted battle, and then at the last second, he gets his sword back in his hand, which is the Scriptures, and he runs the Apollyon through, and Apollyon scampers down the road. Now, the thing that you want to remember about this allegory is that Bunyan's trying to remind all of us that a Christian's life isn't speckled with trouble, it's speckled with peaceful times. Christians ought to expect to be troubled. They ought to expect to be afflicted. They ought to expect to be persecuted. If you're suffering none of those things, it isn't necessarily true that you're not a Christian, but it's a very good sign that you're not one. Later on, we'll run into a passage in 2 Peter where Peter says, look, all those who would live godly in this world will be persecuted. Now, it's one of those things, again, when Peter says that, he's making a sweeping statement. I never hear anybody say, well, that's going to be my promise. That's the scripture I want to live my life by. But it's true. We not only have the afflictions that people normally have, we have additional afflictions. Because what? Well, people are reproachful towards you. People hate Christ and they take it out on you. Many times when people are angry at God, I'll run into them at a dinner party or something, and it's natural for me to bear the brunt of it because I'm visible, God's invisible, and they can't wait to tell me how angry they are at God. Now they always start off by saying, I'm not angry at God, and then they tell you precisely why they are angry at Him. But if you're used to that as a Christian, you realize how terribly difficult it is for people in this world when they don't have God to comfort them. If the God who should be comforting them turns out to be the God that they hate, it's a miserable position. You're stuck with your own strength only, and there's nothing to it. You all know that. So Bunyan wants you to see that he's gone from the valley of humiliation straight to the valley of the shadow of death. It's not an improvement. As bad as the valley of humiliation was for Bunyan, the valley of the shadow of death is worse. And the Bible actually says quite a bit about it. Bunyan says this, you must needs go through it because the way to the celestial city lay through the midst of it. This valley is a very solitary place. Look, if you've ever really been in that situation where your heart is so heavy, your stomach's so upset, your whole countenance down because of troubles and afflictions, you're where Bunyan was. You say, well, Bill, his troubles are different than mine. I'm sure they were worse than yours and mine. Think about this. He's in this prison in Bedford, probably the prison at the bridge, and he's been married now a few months, maybe, as I understand it, maybe 6 months, perhaps 9 months. And he has 4 children from a previous wife. He has a brand new wife. One of the children is a blind girl, Mary. And he chooses to go to prison because he won't quit talking about the gospel. Now, don't you think the neighbors reproached him for that? Don't you think they said, what sort of a man leaves the new wife and 4 children in almost abject poverty? Bunyan, being a tinker, wasn't a wealthy man in the first place, but he left his children. Do you think the neighbors didn't ridicule him? Do you think they didn't stop by and say to him, John, all you have to do is keep your mouth shut. Tell the people that you're sorry, that you recant, that you won't do it, and they'll let you go. There's a lot of pressure to let you go. And he is saying to them, I can't do that. I would cross my conscience. Do you think his mother-in-law, if he had one, do you think she wasn't upset with him? Perhaps the wife, who seems very supportive, didn't really bargain for a husband who was never home, a husband who could give her no money. In fact, he did something like tie laces or something to earn a few pennies to give to her to feed the children. It's a miserable time for him, and God is allowing him to be in prison because God really wants him to write this little book. You see, the afflictions turned to good for him, but you can bet he had a heavy heart every night at sundown when he thought about his children not so many blocks away, trying to get something to eat before they went to bed. He had his own afflictions, his own trials, just as you do, just as I do. And that's what we have in common, and that's why we're all supposed to remember that this life is a gauntlet. We're running it, and it's rough. This life is not about finding heaven here. It's about running through this life, the briars and the brambles, and going to heaven there. When you depart from this life, you get to go home. It's a comfort. It's where you want to be. Now, we've got that backwards these days, and we're always trying to make heaven to be here. But Bunyan wants you to know it's from the valley of humiliation to the valley of the shadow of death, and he's going to describe it to you. So as he starts to enter the valley of the shadow of death, the first thing he sees is 2 men running right at him. And they kind of say to him, oh my God, I'm glad we ran into you. Turn back. Being a Christian's too difficult. Turn back. And Bunyan said, but doesn't the celestial city lie straight ahead? I have to go this way, I think. It's the only way to get there. And these guys are like, it's too dangerous. And they go into this long speech trying to dissuade him from doing it. And it's sort of reminiscent, I think, of Numbers the 13th, when Numbers chapter 13, when the spies entered the promised land. If you remember, all of them except for 2 come back with a terrible report about the giants in the land and how difficult it is and how they could never, ever occupy that land, even though God said they would, except for Joshua and Caleb. And God applauded Joshua and Caleb because of their fearlessness, and the others had troubles with God in that regard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the next little quote from this book. It's actually here where the Christian and the men are arguing still, are kind of discoursing. And I want you to understand that the men are dead set against going ahead. They've turned back to the world, and they're not going to be following Christ.
As I traveled on my journey, few and far between.
Why, the valley itself, which is dark as pitch. We also saw there the hobgoblins, satyrs, and dragons of the pit. We heard also in that valley a continual howling and yelling, as of a people under unutterable misery, who there sat bound in affliction in irons. And over that valley hung the discouraging clouds of confusion. Death also doth always spread his wings over it. In a word, it is every whit dreadful, being utterly without order. You know, if you remember that quote on the board from Pilgrim's Progress, we saw there the hobgoblins, the satyrs, and the dragons of the pit, and there was continual howling and yelling. People in unutterable misery. You got to remember, it's black as pitch, and it's a very good picture of what hell will be like, with the howling all around you and the darkness surrounding you, and just these intermittent screams and the torment and all sorts of other creatures tormented with you that you can't see with your eyes. It's a terrible thing. But here he's talking about walking through life, always in the shadow, in the valley of the shadow of death, because that's really how you live your life. We all do. Every day we feel so composed and we feel like we're on such safe ground. And every moment you're one breath away from being in another world. When you get older, maybe you have the clarity with that a little more. But it's true. Now here in Bunyan's case, you see there's people in misery, but there's people in afflictions and irons and all sorts of slavery and discouraging clouds of confusion and death always spreading its wings.